Hello everybody, today
We are going to start our first section of Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders 5, which is neurodevelopmental disorders, and under this we are going to learn everything strictly as per the DSM-5. So let's just dive right in. What exactly is a neurodevelopmental disorder? What are we really talking about when we use that term? Okay, so here's the formal definition. Neurodevelopmental disorders are a group of conditions that show up during the developmental period. And the two key phrases you really want to lock in on are developmental period, which tells us they start early in life, and atypical brain development. So this isn't something that happens to a person later on. It's really rooted in the very foundation of how their brain and nervous system are put together. And you know, we can actually break the term down to make it even clearer. Neuro, well, that's pretty straightforward. It's all about the brain and the nervous system. Developmental tells us when this all happens, during that supercritical growth period in childhood. And then disorder, that's the final crucial piece. It means there's a significant disruption in what we'd consider typical functioning. You put all three together, and boom, you've got the whole picture. Now, to really get this, we kind of have to shift our whole way of thinking. See, these aren't diseases you can just catch out of the blue. They don't suddenly appear in a brain that was developing normally. Instead, what we're looking at is a fundamental difference in how the brain is built and wired, right from the very beginning. I really want you to take a moment and let this analogy sink in, because it is probably the most important concept in this whole explainer. If the brain is like a building, neurodevelopmental disorders are not damage done to a finished building. They are differences in the original blueprint. Think about that. The entire structure is different from the ground up. And this slide just visualizes that distinction perfectly. Over on the left, you've got the neurodevelopmental disorder, a difference in the blueprint itself. But then you look to the right and you see an acquired condition, something like a traumatic brain injury. That is damage to a building that was already finished. NDDs aren't damage. They are quite literally a different kind of architecture. So if the blueprint is different, the next big question is, why, right? What causes this? And honestly, the answer is not simple at all. In fact, the science is really clear that these disorders are what we call multifactorial. And that just means there is no single, easy explanation. It's more like a really complex interplay of several different factors. Genetics, for sure, play a huge role. There's a very strong hereditary component. Then you have prenatal factors, things that happen during pregnancy or birth. And when we talk about environmental factors, it's really important to know we're not talking about parenting. We mean things like exposure to toxins or severe malnutrition. And all of this together contributes to real, measurable differences in the brain's structure and chemistry. All right, now, just as important as knowing what causes these conditions is knowing what doesn't. This is where we have to be super clear and bust some really harmful myths that are still out there. So let me be absolutely clear. Neurodevelopmental disorders are not caused by bad parenting. They're not caused by a lack of discipline or by laziness. They are not a moral failing. These are medical, neurological conditions. They are not behavioral choices. And, you know, getting rid of these myths is just so incredibly important for creating a supportive world for these individuals and their families. Okay, so we know what they are, what they aren't, and we have a sense of where they come from. So now let's look at what they all have in common. Because while specific disorders like autism or ADHD can look totally different on the surface, all NDDs are united by a set of 6 core characteristics. And here they are. We've got early onset, developmental deficits, their spectrum nature, the fact that they're lifelong, high comorbidity, which is just a fancy way of saying they often show up with other conditions, and finally, functional impairment. We won't have time to go super deep on all 6, but let's pull out a few of the most critical ones to explore. So 2 really big ones are early onset and lifelong duration. Early onset just means the signs were always there in some form, even if a formal diagnosis doesn't happen until later in life. And this leads to a huge point. These conditions are lifelong. Because they're baked into the brain's structure, they aren't something a person just outgrows. But, and this is a huge but, the symptoms can absolutely change, and they can be managed over a lifetime with the right support. Another core feature is what we call their spectrum nature. This is exactly why you hear terms like autism spectrum disorder. It means that symptoms can range all the way from very mild to profound, and 2 people with the very same diagnoses can look completely different. And to make things even more complex, it's actually incredibly common for a person to have more than one of these conditions at the same time. We call that comorbidity. So this is the really crucial part. What's the line between just having some traits and having a clinical disorder? Well, the answer is functional impairment.
A diagnosis is only made when these developmental differences cause significant, real-world difficulty in a person's life, whether that's socially, at school, or at work. Without that impairment, we just call it a difference, not a disorder. And that idea of impairment leads us perfectly into our next section, looking at the real-world impact of these conditions and, maybe most importantly, what the goals of diagnosis and support are all about.
And wow, the impact of these conditions can be incredibly broad. I mean, they can affect pretty much any area of development, everything from cognition and communication to social skills, attention, and even the way the brain processes sensory information, like sound or touch.
Because it's all so complex, the diagnostic process has to be incredibly thorough. It's not just some quick checklist, not at all. It involves a really deep dive into a person's developmental history, using standardized testing, direct observation, and getting reports from parents and teachers, all while carefully ruling out any other possible reasons for the symptoms. It's a very comprehensive, multi-layered evaluation.
So since we've already established that these conditions aren't something you can cure, what's the point? What's the goal? Well, it's all about management and support. The focus is on things like early intervention, targeted therapies, and getting the right accommodations in school. But the one I really want to draw your attention to is that last one, building on unique strengths. The goal isn't just to manage deficits, it's to help individuals lead successful, fulfilling lives by leveraging what they're amazing at.
So let's wrap this all up with a final summary. Neurodevelopmental disorders are brain-based conditions that show up early in life. They are lifelong, they exist on the spectrum, and, this is the most important part, while they are not curable, they are highly manageable with the right kind of support and intervention.
So, I'm going to leave you with one last question to really chew on. If we truly accept that these disorders are a difference in the brain's blueprint, not some kind of flaw in its construction, well, that changes everything, doesn't it? The question is no longer, how do we fix the person? But it becomes, how can we redesign our environments, our schools, our workplaces, our communities to better fit all kinds of minds?
Now, moving forward within the DSM-5 framework, we will focus specifically on intellectual disability.
So let's just get right to it with a question I get constantly. Is this whole thing just about a number? Does it all just boil down to getting a low score on an IQ test? It seems like a simple question, but the answer really unlocks the entire modern way of thinking about this condition.
And the answer, straight from the DSM-5, is a hard no. Now, don't get me wrong, an IQ score is definitely part of the picture, but it's just one piece of a much, much bigger puzzle. The diagnosis today is way more holistic, focusing on how a person actually functions in their day-to-day life.
Okay, so to build our foundation here, let's get the official definition on the table. When a clinician uses this term, what are they actually talking about?
So the clinical term you'll see is intellectual disability, which is also called intellectual developmental disorder. The definition is really built on two main pillars. First, you have limitations in intellectual functioning. That's things like reasoning, problem-solving, learning. And second, you have limitations in adaptive behavior. Those are the skills we all need for daily life. And here's a critical point. Both of these have to show up before a person turns 18.
This brings us to the real heart of the diagnosis. To actually confirm an intellectual disability, a clinician has to check off 3 essential criteria. Think of these as the non-negotiable rules of the game. And here is something that's absolutely critical to understand. The number is 3. This isn't like some other diagnoses where a doctor might say, well, you need 5 out of 9 symptoms. Nope. For this, it's not a checklist you can pick and choose from. All 3 criteria have to be met, period. It's a package deal. So what are these 3 big rules? Well, here's our roadmap. Criterion A is all about those deficits in intellectual functioning. Criterion B covers deficits in adaptive functioning or daily life skills. And Criterion C locks in the timing. It all has to start during that developmental period. Let's dig into each one.
First up, Criterion A. This is looking at challenges in mental abilities. Things like reasoning through a problem, planning ahead, or thinking abstractly. And it's not just a gut feeling. These deficits have to be confirmed by a proper clinical assessment and standardized IQ testing.
Next is Criterion B, and honestly, this is where the DSM-5 made a really important shift. This part looks at adaptive functioning, basically how well a person handles the demands of everyday life compared to others their age. It's broken down into 3 areas: conceptual skills like money and time, social skills, and practical skills like personal care. This is where you see the real-world impact.
And finally, the last piece of the puzzle, Criterion C, is pretty straightforward.
These challenges can't be the result of, say, a traumatic brain injury as an adult. They have to have been present during childhood or the teenage years, basically any time before the person turns 18.
Okay, so once all three of those criteria are met, a diagnosis can be made. But that's not the end of the story because this condition exists on a spectrum. The DSM-5 actually lays out 4 levels of severity. And here's the kicker. These levels are determined not by an IQ score, but by how much support a person needs to function in their daily adaptive life.
Let's start with the most common level on the spectrum, which is mild intellectual disability. This actually accounts for the vast majority of cases.
So let's meet Maria. She's 22, has her own apartment, and she works at a local grocery store. Intellectually, she might have a tough time with abstract ideas or more complex math. In her daily life, she needs a little help to manage her budget and can sometimes be a bit too naive with strangers. But the key here is the support level. It's minimal. A caseworker might pop in once a week, and that's enough to help her lead a pretty independent and full life.
All right, moving along the spectrum, we have moderate intellectual disability. And at this level, that need for support really becomes a regular part of everyday life.
Think about someone like James. He's 19 and lives in a group home. Academically, his skills are more at a grade school level, and he has a hard time with abstract ideas like money or making future plans. He needs daily reminders for things like personal hygiene and requires supervision for most of his activities. You can see the support here is consistent. It's a built-in part of his daily structure.
As we continue on to severe intellectual disability, the amount of support a person needs becomes much more intensive. It's really needed on a constant basis. Let's take a look at Sarah's case. She's 16 and her communication is mostly through single words or gestures. She doesn't have a conceptual grasp of things like letters or numbers, and she needs constant supervision just to stay safe. She really requires help with all her daily activities, everything from getting dressed to eating her meals.
And finally, we arrive at the profound level of severity. This level is characterized by a complete dependence on other people for basically all aspects of care. 10-year-old Sarah is a good example here. She's nonverbal and expresses herself mostly through body language. She's completely dependent on her caregivers for all of her physical needs, for her health, and for her safety. The support she requires is intensive, 24/7 care to make sure she is safe and well.
This table really lays it all out nicely, doesn't it? You can clearly see how that need for support just ramps up as you move across the levels. And yeah, we've listed the typical IQ ranges here for context, but I'm going to say it again because it's that important. The label, whether it's mild, moderate, severe, or profound, it all comes down to the level of support a person needs to function in their life, not just a number on a test.
Okay, that was a lot of clinical detail, so let's just zoom out for a second and lock in the most important big picture things to take away from all this. First, and you've heard me say this a few times, all 3 of those criteria, intellectual deficits, adaptive deficits, and early onset, have to be there, no exceptions. Second, the modern diagnosis rightly puts the focus on adaptive functioning, what a person can actually do in the real world, not just their IQ score. Third, it's so important to remember that people with intellectual disability have unique strengths, just like all of us. And finally, and maybe most importantly, with the right support that's tailored to them, they absolutely can live rich, meaningful, and fulfilling lives.
And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? Now that we understand the clinical framework, the real work begins for us as people. How can we, in our own lives, shift our perspective? How do we move away from only seeing a person's limitations and start focusing on recognizing their unique strengths and figuring out what support they need to really shine?
Now that we understand intellectual disability and its diagnostic framework, let's move forward to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. We will examine what ADHD is, how the DSM-5 defines it, its core symptoms, and how it presents across different age groups.
You know, you hear that term thrown around all the time, but what's the real line between just being a bit distracted and having a clinical disorder? Well, in this explainer, we're going to make that line crystal clear by walking through the official criteria clinicians actually use.
So, to get us started, think about it like this. The inattention part of ADHD. It can feel like you're trying to watch your favorite show, but some invisible force has the remote and just keeps flipping through the channels. Your brain just won't settle on the one you've picked. And that internal fight, that struggle to stay on track, that's really at the heart of the experience for so many.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll define what ADHD actually is. Then, we'll break down the 2 main symptom lists that clinicians use. After that, we'll draw that really important line between what's normal behavior and what's considered a disorder. Then we'll cover the 4 big rules for a diagnosis, see what it looks like in real life, and we'll wrap up with why getting an accurate diagnosis is so incredibly important.
All right, so let's start with the absolute basics. What exactly is ADHD, according to the people who actually diagnose it?
Okay, so the official definition has a few really key parts. First, it's called neurodevelopmental. That just means it's a brain-based condition, and it starts early on in childhood. Second, it's a persistent pattern. This isn't about having a bad week or a stressful month. And third, and honestly, this is the most critical piece, it has to interfere with functioning. If these behaviors aren't causing real significant problems in someone's life, it just doesn't meet the clinical criteria for a disorder.
So all the symptoms of ADHD fall into 2 main buckets, or domains. On one side, you've got inattention. Now, this isn't about being defiant or lazy, it's a genuine struggle for the brain to stay locked onto a single track. On the other side, you have hyperactivity impulsivity. This is all about that excessive physical movement and the tendency to just act, without thinking through the consequences first. A person can have symptoms from just one of these domains or from both of them.
Okay, so now let's get into the nitty-gritty. Clinicians use a very specific checklist of symptoms from the official diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, to see if someone's experience lines up with the criteria. So this is our first list, and it's all about inattention. For a diagnosis, a child needs to show 6 or more of these symptoms, and for an adult, it's 5 or more. You know, think about the student who makes careless mistakes on a test, not because they don't know the material, but because their brain just skipped over the details. Or the adult who is always losing their keys, their wallet, their phone, or who starts a project with all the enthusiasm in the world, but just gets sidetracked and never actually finishes it.
And here's the second list, this one for hyperactivity and impulsivity. The rule is the same, 6 for kids, 5 for adults. This covers things like constant fidgeting, being totally unable to stay seated through a meeting, talking nonstop, or blurting out an answer before the question is even done. It's that feeling that patients describe as being driven by a motor that you just can't turn off.
Okay, but let's be real. Everyone loses their keys sometimes, right? And what kid doesn't get fidgety in a boring class? This brings us to what is maybe the most important part of this whole explainer. How do we draw the line between these very, very human behaviors and an actual clinical disorder?
This table right here, this is where the rubber meets the road. It makes the distinction so clear. See, the key isn't the behavior itself, but its frequency, its duration, and its impact. For a behavior to be considered a symptom of ADHD, it has to be happening pretty much daily, it has to have been going on for at least 6 months, it feels totally involuntary, and it has to show up in multiple places, like at home and at school. And the big one, it has to be actively messing up a person's life.
Right, so even if someone checks off enough boxes from those symptom lists, believe it or not, that's still not enough for a diagnosis. It has to pass through 4 clinical gatekeepers, or rules that make sure we aren't just mislabeling a temporary problem or something else entirely.
Let's just walk through these. First up, early start. A bunch of these symptoms have to have been there before the age of 12. This tells us the issue is developmental, not just a reaction to stress last year. Second, it has to pop up in 2 or more settings. If a kid is only hyper at home but is perfectly focused at school, that probably points to something else. Third, real-life impact. This is the so what test. If the symptoms aren't causing actual problems with school or work or friendships, it's not a disorder. And finally, a clinician has to make sure that these symptoms aren't better explained by a different condition.
So, now we've got the definition, the symptoms, and the rules. Let's see how all of this actually comes together in real people.
So ADHD can show up in one of 3 main ways, which we call presentations. You can have the combined type, where you have enough symptoms from both lists. You can have the predominantly hyperactive/impulsive type, or you can have the predominantly inattentive presentation. This is the person who isn't bouncing off the walls at all, but is quietly struggling to focus. This is often that daydreamer kid who gets totally missed.
And this chart, wow, it really drives home why recognizing that inattentive type is so critical. I mean, look at that. The predominantly attentive presentation is by far the most common, making up over 2/3 of all cases. This is exactly why the stereotype of the hyperactive little boy is so misleading, and it's why so many people, especially girls, can go their whole lives without a diagnosis.
So let's make this really concrete with a quick case study. Let's meet Sarah. She's 20 years old, and she's a perfect example of the inattentive presentation.
See how Sarah's struggles map directly onto those criteria we just talked about? Missing deadlines at work is a classic example of fails to finish tasks. Losing her keys 3 times this month,
Well, that's on the list. Not remembering what her boyfriend just said falls right under seems not to listen. And since these things started way back when she was a kid and they happen at work and at home, she meets the full criteria.
Okay, now let's meet Jackson. He's 8 years old, and he represents that more classic, combined presentation of ADHD that most people picture in their heads.
Now, with Jackson, you can see both of those lists in action, right? The constant fidgeting and getting up from his seat, that's hyperactivity. Shouting out answers without waiting, that's impulsivity. But he also loses his worksheets almost every single day. That's inattention, and he can't sustain his focus on his work. He clearly has more than enough symptoms from both domains to get a combined diagnosis.
So, we've defined ADHD, we've seen how it's diagnosed, but why does going through this really rigorous process matter so much in the first place?
This quote, it really gets right to the heart of it. Because on the one hand, if you underdiagnose, if you miss it, leaving ADHD untreated can lead to huge problems. Failing in school, job instability, relationship struggles. But on the other hand, if you overdiagnose, you can end up medicalizing normal behavior, which leads to unnecessary stigma in treatment. It's a really delicate balance.
And that's why accuracy is just everything. Getting an accurate diagnosis isn't about slapping a label on someone. It's about opening a door. It's the pathway to getting the right kind of support, things like behavioral therapies and, when it's appropriate, medication. And these treatments are proven to help manage the symptoms and can truly dramatically improve a person's life. So, this brings us to one last big question to think about. Knowing just how strict these clinical guidelines are, how do we, as a society, balance that risk of mislabeling normal, everyday behavior with the absolute need to help people who are genuinely and profoundly struggling? It's a challenge, for sure, and one that requires our constant, careful attention.
Now that we have covered most of the major neurodevelopmental disorders outlined in the DSM-5, let us move on to the final, and perhaps one of the most significant, conditions: autism spectrum disorder.
Autism isn't about a brain being broken or wrong. It's about having a fundamentally different kind of wiring that just perceives and processes the world in its own unique way. So what's the official definition? Well, ASD is what's called a neurodevelopmental condition. That basically means it starts during early brain development and affects how a person communicates, interacts with others, and behaves. And it's called a spectrum for a super important reason. No two autistic people are the same. The experience can range from having very mild traits to facing challenges that need significant support every day. Okay, so how do professionals actually diagnose ASD? For that, we've got to look at the official checklist from the DSM-5. Think of it like a rule book. To get a diagnosis, a person has to meet all 3 of the criteria in Part A, which is all about social communication. The first thing on the checklist is a persistent difficulty with what clinicians call social-emotional reciprocity. Now, that's a fancy term, but it really just means the natural give and take that conversations are built on. You know, that back and forth rhythm of a social dance.
So, what does that actually look like in real life? Well, it might be someone who can talk for 20 minutes straight about their passion, say trains or video games, but never once pauses to ask you about your day. Or it could be a child who doesn't think to show you a drawing they're proud of, just to share that moment of joy. It's a disconnect in that shared social feeling.
Next up, the diagnosis requires struggles with all those silent signals we use to communicate. Everything we say without actually using words. We're talking body language, tone of voice, facial expressions, the whole 9 yards.
You might see this as someone who avoids eye contact or maybe does the opposite and stares so intensely it feels a little uncomfortable. It's also about missing the sarcasm in a phrase like, "Oh, great job," when something clearly went wrong, or just not picking up that a frown and rolled eyes means someone is annoyed.
And the last mandatory piece of this social puzzle is a consistent struggle with developing, keeping, and just plain understanding relationships. And it's so important to remember this goes way beyond just being shy. In day-to-day life, this might be the kid who always chooses to play alone and doesn't seem interested in other kids. Or it could be an adult who finds work parties completely baffling and draining because they just can't crack the code of small talk and office friendships.
Okay, so just to be clear, a person has to meet all 3 of those social criteria we just talked about. But that's not all. They also have to show at least 2 different types of restricted or repetitive behaviors from this next section, Part B. And a few other things have to be true too. The symptoms had to start early on, they have to cause real-life problems, and they can't be better explained by another condition. So with that whole picture in mind, let's jump into Part B. First up in this category are those repetitive movements or sounds, which you'll often hear called stimming. And this is really important. It's not just some nervous habit. For a lot of autistic people, these actions are a crucial way to self-soothe when they feel overwhelmed or to express a really big emotion like joy.
And this is where you can see how something as simple as play can look totally different. So instead of racing toy cars and making up a story, a child might find a lot of comfort and order in lining them up perfectly. Other examples are things like flapping hands when they get excited or repeating lines from a movie over and over. That's a behavior called echolalia.
All right, next up is this deep, deep need for sameness and routine. You can think of it like this. For many autistic people, the world can feel incredibly chaotic and unpredictable. Routines are like a safe harbor, creating a sense of order. So when those routines get broken, it can be really, really distressing.
This isn't just about being picky, right? It's that kid who will only eat a sandwich if it's cut in a very specific way, no exceptions. Or the adult whose entire day feels off-kilter if their precise morning coffee ritual gets disrupted. When that pattern breaks, the world can just feel fundamentally wrong.
And finally, we have sensory differences. This is huge. It's all about the brain processing sights, sounds, textures, and smells in a non-typical way. It can swing one of two ways, either being extremely oversensitive or hyperreactive, or being undersensitive, which is hyporeactive.
So for example, someone who's hypersensitive, a trip to the supermarket could feel like a full-on sensory assault with the bright lights and overlapping sounds. But on the flip side, someone who's hyposensitive might not even feel the cold on a winter day or notice a pretty bad scrape. It's like they're living in a completely different sensory reality.
So we have the checklist, but what does this look like when it's all put together in a real person? Let's see how these criteria work in the real world with a couple of quick case studies.
So here we've got Sarah, a successful 32-year-old. And if you look at the chart, you can see how she checks off all 3 A boxes and multiple B boxes. But here's the really interesting part. Her traits were there in childhood, that's criterion C, but she learned to mask or hide them to fit in. This is super common, especially in women. For her, a diagnosis isn't a bad thing. It's an explanation for a lifetime of feeling different.
This is such a crucial point. Not every socially awkward person has ASD, and this comparison really shows why. Look at Liam. His social difficulties are pervasive, they're present everywhere, and he has the required repetitive behaviors. Now look at Zara. Yeah, she's shy with strangers, but she's totally fine with her family and best friend. She doesn't meet the mandatory criteria, so her struggles are much better explained by something like social anxiety.
You see, getting a diagnosis isn't an end point or just a label. For so many people, it's actually the beginning of a new chapter, one of self-understanding, finding the right kind of support, and learning to leverage their unique strengths. To help guide that support, the DSM-5 uses 3 levels. Level 1 describes someone who is largely independent but might benefit from help with planning or social situations. Level 3, on the other hand, describes someone who needs very substantial daily support. It's a practical way to describe needs, not a person's worth.
And understanding all of this matters because ASD is not rare. The latest CDC data shows it affects about 1 in every 36 children. This means you almost certainly know someone on the spectrum, whether they have a diagnosis or not.
Ultimately, the modern conversation around autism has shifted dramatically. The goal is no longer to fix someone or make them appear neurotypical. It's all about acceptance, providing the right support, and celebrating the idea of neurodiversity, the fundamental understanding that brain differences are natural, normal, and valuable parts of being human.
Which leads us with a final thought to ponder. When we stop looking at autism as a list of deficits and start seeing it as just a different way of experiencing the world, what amazing strengths can emerge? Things like incredible attention to detail, deep focus, unwavering honesty, and a unique perspective. What can we all learn from seeing the world through that different lens?